What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Star Wars Jedi Survivor, the anticipated sequel to Jedi Fallen Order, following the story of Cal Kestis in the wake of Order 66, which wiped out the Jedi. However, as this review is coming out a few days after release, we also have the benefit of knowing that currently there's a lot of problems with performance, especially on PC, but also on consoles as well, so all of that and more we'll be diving into over the course of this review. A few things to note here at the beginning, though. First up, we have spoilers. Not that I'll be covering them, but rather I will be going over the story setup for the game, talking a little bit about that. And while I won't be going into great detail, there might be still some contextual things in the footage as well, so do bear that stuff in mind. In addition to that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that, though in the case of the achievements for this one, they were initially bugged on the Steam release because this game uses the EA app as a sort of DRM, and for whatever reason, the connection between the EA app and Steam wasn't working, so the achievements were unlocking on the EA app, but not Steam. Though that, unlike the game's other problems, was fixed very quickly and was pretty much sorted out by Friday morning, after which I didn't really have any problems. That said though, this game, much like the first one, is a very easy 100%, and if you'd like to verify that for yourself, my Steam profile is linked down below, alongside a video that will cover everything that I go over in these reviews. Feel free to check all that out if you want more information. So, Jedi Survivor at its core aims to be a third-person action-adventure that sees us playing, of course, as a Jedi, Cal Kestis, using all sorts of force powers alongside lightsaber combat to fight the Imperials to the best of our ability. And much like the Star Wars franchise at large, this goes heavy into big cinematic moments, perfect for showcasing what a Jedi would be capable of. And for the most part, I think Jedi Survivor improves upon and expands upon everything that the first game did, which was received quite well. And for the most part, Survivor succeeds at that. However, all of those expansions and continuations from that game are a bit overshadowed by this game's technical state at launch, which is why we're going to start the video talking about that. Currently, there is a very large quantity of reports about very poor performance and bugs across a variety of hardware, mostly on PC, I would say, but it does seem some of these issues do extend onto the console versions as well. And while I can't report on all of that, I can tell you about my experience, which is naturally what I'm going to do. I was playing this on a 4090 and a 13900K, and while that experience seems to have been better than most people's, it was not without its issues. Most of what I ran into was constant minor problems, things like the game stuttering or freezing for a few seconds, frame rate dips seemingly at random, which actually occurred a few hours after the start of the game, which is where most people were talking about having a lot of issues, was the prologue. For me, the majority of issues didn't start until I got out of the prologue. And while certainly annoying, a lot of these minor issues weren't really game-breaking by any means. However, the most serious issue that I ran into, I think, was the result of ray tracing, actually. But on one of the planets you can travel to, known as Jeddah, the game crashed constantly. In fact, so much so that I would say probably at least 2 to 3 hours of my playtime here is literally just loading the game back up from the crashes that would occur there. However, because of this frequency, I was able to sort of isolate what the problem might be, given some of the reports from Respawn Entertainment themselves, the developer, talking about how some of the graphical settings might be specifically the issue. And while that wasn't the specific case that I had that they were referring to, it got me thinking about messing around with some of the options. So I was like, well, the first and most obvious thing is to turn ray tracing off, after which I had 0 crashes from that point out, and this was at 4K. However, that did not solve all of the other problems, which were, again, just a variety of minor bugs, mostly visual in nature. But personally, the crashing on that one planet was by far and away the game's biggest problem. However, I do think that because of the nature of this game being $70 as a base price here in the US, as publishers continue to try to push up the price of a full AAA game to then turn around and launch in a more or less broken state for a lot of people, is naturally a pretty big no-go. And given the amount of reports across all types of hardware, I find it exceedingly unlikely that EA was unaware of this, or more importantly, Respawn themselves, and while I sincerely doubt we'll ever know the whole truth of that matter, it certainly makes the entire thing come across as disingenuous, especially as this is just the latest in a slew of PC releases that have had those same problems. So while these issues will eventually be fixed, or at least they most likely will, it's still very frustrating to see here at the launch of the game. But from there, let's move on to other things, though because we were talking about the technical stuff, I want to jump right into the Steam Deck compatibility. If you're looking to play this on the Steam Deck, or were thinking about it, my advice to you would be don't, which probably doesn't come as much of a surprise given all the other issues, but every time I tried to play this on the Steam Deck, it would launch, but then it would crash probably 30 seconds to a minute in. But bizarrely, that's not even the biggest issue here. Due to the DRM at play with the PC version of this game, playing it on even more than just one computer might trigger the DRM to lock you out of the game for a couple hours. I don't know the exact time frame, but somewhere in there, which is especially annoying if you like to bounce back and forth between your PC and your Steam Deck. So even if it was working on the Steam Deck, I still don't know that I'd actually want to play it there, and it's hard to say if that issue in particular will get resolved. But now we are moving on to other things. So let's talk difficulty settings and New Game Plus. So difficulty for this game comes in Story to Grandmaster. Most of what this affects is timing, specifically around the time you have to parry the enemy, incoming enemy damage on top of how aggressive those enemies are. Jedi Knight, I imagine, will be plenty for most people, as that is effectively normal, though once you get a good grasp of the parrying and blocking system at play here, the game does become very easy, except in moments where you are vastly outnumbered, which does come up a few times. So while this game does have minor Souls-like elements, I would not consider it a particularly difficult game, and you can change the difficulty at any time, except when you're like in the middle of combat, I believe. So the game's got a little something for everyone in that regard. But then we have New Game Plus. After you beat the game, you can start what the game calls New Journey Plus, but New Game Plus, at which point you can start over with all of your accumulated skill points as well as all your unlocked cosmetics, on top of a few extra perks to change up the playthrough. Utilizing this game's perk system, which we'll discuss more later, you can take a few free perks to change the way enemies behave or swap out combat encounters for more challenging ones, just to give yourself something extra to do if you want to keep playing after the initial credits roll. But from there, let's get into the story setup for this game. Again, gonna be some spoilers here, so you might want to skip past this, but for everyone here at the beginning, the story plus doing a lot of side stuff along the way took me around 20 hours. I didn't do everything by any means, but running through the main story and doing side quests as I ran into them was about a 20-hour experience, with roughly another 10 or so being spent on clearing the rest of the maps and finding everything that I had missed. However, waiting until late game to do that can be very beneficial because some of the rewards later in the game will actually just show you where everything is on the map, which makes mopping everything up very quick, which makes this, again, a pretty easy 100%. So if you're looking for a rough time estimate, that's about it for you. So if you're looking to do everything one time, you're looking at probably around 30-ish hours, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. I personally probably could have cut some hours off of it if it wasn't for the crashing issue I mentioned earlier, just as an example. But from there, let's actually talk about the story a little bit. So the story takes place a few years after the initial game ends, with our team and our teammates from that game having disbanded and mostly went their separate ways. Cal Kestis has kept up his fight against the Empire, basically just being a thorn in their side, and somewhat becoming one of their main public enemies, especially as a surviving Jedi, though he is officially largely seen as a terrorist. However, early in the prologue, the game makes it very clear that the Empire is only growing stronger from here, and given all of the other events in this universe, we kind of know where this has to go already, as the total defeat of the Empire isn't exactly on the table, and as such, and as the name of the game might imply to you, the goal becomes to switch gears a little bit and focus more on surviving to fight another day, so to speak. And while that's about as much as I want to tell you story-wise, before I get into some of my thoughts on it in general, do remember there might be some contextual stuff in the footage from here. But my broad thoughts on the story were that mostly it was pretty good. It does have some really great big cinematic moments, and it also does a great job developing a lot of the characters they introduced in that first game while also introducing you to a few more. However, I would say that the first roughly 2/3 of the game are pretty slow. A lot of it is just kind of platforming from one place to another, fighting Imperials and other things along the way, before a minor plot advancement, and then you go back and do the same thing somewhere else. And that makes the first, again, roughly 2/3 of the game kind of slow until it finally starts to pick up towards the end, and everything starts to sort of come together, at which point I was pretty interested. But again, along the way, there are a lot of big cinematic moments. However, because of that, while I do think the story was good and I appreciated it, especially what they did with some of the characters, it did kind of feel like it wasn't going anywhere for a very long time in the beginning. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, so keep that in mind as we move into the world and gameplay section. While the overall structure might be relatively similar to the first game, it is different in some key ways. For starters, as I mentioned towards the very beginning of this video, Jedi Survivor tries to expand and improve upon even a lot of the features from the first game and basically just do more using that same base foundation. And for the most part, I think it succeeds at that part, which is a shame given the performance of the title itself. So while I wouldn't really consider this game open world by any means, most of the game does take place on 2 planets, one of which serves as your sort of main hub, known as Kobo, which is definitely the biggest area by far, and you're very free to explore. There's a lot of indirect progression systems involved, which give you the ability to run around and do a lot of fun stuff. Outside of those large 2 planets, there will be other places you can go, but these areas are mostly for story developments. There isn't nearly as much there to explore and see, so something to keep in mind. All along the way, the game is very much so a Star Wars adventure. A lot of the characters, factions, etc. are presented and shown off in a very cinematic fashion, as you'd probably expect from a brand that is as prominent as Star Wars has become. Though I will say this particular game does bring up the High Republic era, which predates where we are in the timeline here by quite a bit, and while it's certainly not an overbearing amount, it is kind of cool to see some of that stuff in a full-fledged AAA production of Star Wars here. But let's talk about how you're going to be moving through the world and how some of this stuff is going to work. So, right off the bat, the game does have some Souls-light elements, emphasis on light. For the most part, I personally would consider this more of an action adventure, as most of the game involves using force powers and everything to platform around, solve a few puzzles here and there, and then fight enemies who you are typically vastly stronger than. However, this is done for starters using a checkpoint system with meditation points. Meditation points serve as your place to rest, heal up, replace all of your healing items, potentially spend any skill points you have, train if you should so choose, or simply fast travel to other meditation points that you've found. When resting at these points, while it will heal and restore your healing items, it does also respawn all enemies outside of specific boss enemies, and it also does not reset your environmental progression, that is to say any unlocked shortcuts will still remain intact. And if you happen to die, the last meditation point that you used will be where you respawn at. When you die, you'll lose all of your experience towards your current skill point until you go either re-engage that enemy in combat or go pick it up off the ground, whichever one is relevant. However, even this is a pretty minor setback, as the most you will ever lose is the experience on your current skill point, meaning that your potential loss is relatively minor, so I really wouldn't even worry about it that much. And honestly, that's probably the main things to know going into this game, but a few other points I wanted to talk about. Kobo, as I mentioned, serves as your sort of main hub, and this comes with a cantina of sorts that you can upgrade by traveling and exploring the world. You do this by recruiting various people, by completing side quests or running into them, etc., doing favors for them. They can potentially join you back at the cantina, each of them usually bringing something else to the table, possibly pointing you in the direction of more things to find, as these people at the cantina usually serve as your quest givers, so to speak. They're called roomers technically, but they'll basically point you in the right direction. And this leads to a lot of indirect progression systems around the cantina itself, with you being able to plant a garden on the roof, fix up the fish tank, and interact with all sorts of other characters as you sort of build a little community out here, which overall I think is pretty good. It gives you a reason to explore, things are changing and moving, especially in the cantina itself, and it gives you sort of a main hub to operate out of. In addition to this game introduces beast riding for us. There are a handful of animals throughout the game we can use to help us get around, such as our chocobo knockoffs known as the Neckos, or an animal that will help us glide long distances, etc. So even in the traversal, they've added some new things, which is nice, especially given the larger areas that we'll be exploring. I do want to mention there that the reward for doing most of that exploring tends to be cosmetics, which was also the case for the first game. However, it's really cranked up to 11 here. There's just so many cosmetics, and kind of an odd choice that they made is that throughout several areas of the game, you can collect various things from exploring that act as a sort of currency. Be this a mineral on Kobo or scrolls on Jeddah, and you can turn those into a vendor, but the reward from those vendors is 9 out of 10 cosmetics. They do sell a couple of other things, but it's mostly stuff that's going to like increase your maximum healing items, that kind of thing. And for the most part, it's cosmetics. So whereas the first game was just like, hey, explore and you'll find these cosmetics, this game took the bizarre step of being like, hey, go find this stuff, bring it back to a vendor, and then get the cosmetic, which just seems like a weird, unnecessary step to take, honestly. Though, as I mentioned much earlier, the nice thing about all this is late game, you can find some rewards that will actually mark basically everything you missed on the map for you, which makes tracking them all down very easy. Though I would encourage you to engage with the cantina system a good bit, because some of the side quests that you can pick up there are really interesting and fun. And while some of it is very much so like, hey, go find this thing that would have been here anyway, a few of them do lead to some really unique and interesting little side moments that I do think were worth the time investment. Though speaking of side activities, so to speak, it does seem like they took a note from Breath of the Wild with their Jedi chambers, or whatever the official name is. Across Kobo, you can find various chambers where you'll have to use the Force in some way to solve a more significant puzzle than is typically present in the rest of the game, which will usually lead you to the reward of something like a perk that you can now use, or just a flat upgrade. But perhaps the most useful thing to find while exploring the world leans more into the progression systems, which we're just about to get into, so I'll mention it here. And that is these little Force shrines. They're a little more out of the way than most stuff, but these little shrines, when you find them, will give you a permanent boost of some sort, usually either to your health or Force, just increasing the maximums, or potentially just giving you a skill point outright. So those are always worth finding, and they were probably the single most rewarding thing to find, so I would definitely keep an eye out for those. But all in all, I would say the worlds are interesting, they're fun to explore, and while they definitely run out of ideas, I would say after a little while, as there's really only so many ways you can navigate the same environment, it was nonetheless pretty fun to do. Though I would say most of it, because the reward is simply cosmetics, is going to be superfluous for most people. So while it was fun to do those things for me, not really something I'd recommend. But that does finally bring us to our progression systems. Progression in this game is relatively simple, but it's important to note that Cal starts with pretty much all the powers you picked up in the first game. And as such, the places this game had to go in terms of progression are a little more limited, and you wind up feeling very strong out of the gate, especially in comparison to the original title, which is, again, probably the right way to go here. But nonetheless, we have some things to talk about. Mostly this boils down to skills, other abilities, the Force shrines that I mentioned, and the perks. As I already talked about the Force shrines, I won't go over that twice. But skill points are pretty straightforward. As you kill enemies and complete various moments in the story, you'll earn experience towards your next skill point. When you earn them, you can go to a meditation point and spend them on various aspects of your character, which are the 5 lightsaber stances, the 3 trees for your Force powers, or your survival tree. Survival is more basic stuff like max health, that kind of thing, and lightsaber and Force are your more combat-oriented abilities that give you more options with the way you would like to engage with the game. Outside of these, there are some other abilities you can find elsewhere, and typically speaking, these are abilities you'll unlock along the story that will give you access to various new methods of traversal, such as our droid BD-1 being able to shoot electric darts to overload circuits to get by various electronic problems, and various other things like that. It's also possible to find the ability to hack various droids, and those abilities can either be found out in the environment by completing certain puzzles, or they can also be found by completing bounty hunts, which is another side activity I didn't really talk about, but it's bounty hunting, it's pretty self-explanatory. But then the last bit of progression I want to mention is the perk system. Once you get access to it, you will have various perk slots that you can insert any acquired perks into. You can find perks from a variety of places, potentially as a reward from one of the Force shrines that I mentioned, or completing one of the Jedi trial chambers. So these come from a few different places, but these will augment your ability abilities in some way. They are not all made equal, however, and some of them can potentially take up to 3 of your perk slots, and you only start with 3 to begin with, though you can find a few more. And the biggest determining factors in how you play this game is largely the perks you're using combined with the skills you've picked up. And that naturally leads us right into the combat section of the video. Combat here, as you would probably guess, is mostly the same as the original title, albeit with a few expansions in some key areas. But at the end of the day, we're playing a very specific Jedi, and there's really only so many ways you can do that. But at a very fundamental level, combat in this game is really about blocking and parrying, because while we and most of our enemies do not have a stamina bar, we do have a block bar, which is this white bar above our health, which limits your ability to block incoming damage. You can only block until that bar empties, at which point they will get a hit through. So you can just kind of ready up a block. However, if an enemy does a power attack where they flash red, you won't be able to block that or anything. You need to dodge out of the way. If you're more comfortable with the timing, you can try to parry right as an enemy will go to hit you, at which point you can counterattack and do a ton of damage to their block bar, thereby limiting the amount of damage mitigation they can take from you. So a lot of combat comes down to managing that aspect of it and getting a good feel for it. And once you do, combat's pretty much a breeze. However, some key things to know there is that if you hit an enemy in their back or anything, they won't block you because they can't, obviously. And then some enemies like droids don't have a block meter, they'll just take the hit. And once you've got that mechanic down though, you're pretty much set for the rest of the game. However, nonetheless, we do have a few other things to talk about. For starters, stances. We're going to get up to 5 of them. We can only have 2 equipped at once that we can swap between. We can set these at our meditation points, but our stances are effectively combat styles. We have our single saber stance, we have our dual bladed stance, our dual wielding stance, and then the 2 new ones are blaster stance as well as our crossguard stance, which is like a 2-hander. Each of these is going to provide you a different play style and affect your stats and damage a little bit. The blaster and the 2-hander are new here, the blaster actually giving you a decent amount of ranged options. However, you do only have a set number of shots and then have to engage in melee, and personally I never kind of got the feel for it, so I didn't care for it much. The other option is the crossguard, which is obviously inspired by Kylo Ren, or at least the newer Star Wars movies at this point. And this offers you a slower moving but heavier hitting option for those who like to use a more 2-handed approach. Personally, of all of these, dual wield was my favorite because it was very quick, and some of the skills for dual wielding in particular I really enjoyed, like a hold and release parry option, which had a more devastating follow-up counterattack than the regular standard one. But each of these stances has something to offer, though at most I would lean into the 2 that you would like. However, you are pretty well free to mix all this stuff up, as your first skill reset is free, and then after that it only costs a single skill point to reset all your skills and focus on something different. So if you want to try all these different styles, it's pretty easy to do so. But the other side of this is, of course, our force powers. Nothing really too much in the way of new stuff here. Push, pull, slow enemies, lift them, drop them, potentially confuse them to fight other enemies for you. And while I would say the main focus here is on the more lightsaber-oriented combat, the force powers do offer something fun, as force pushing enemies off of ledges will never get old. But this is mitigated by your in-combat force meter. Out of combat, this doesn't matter at all, but in combat you can only use force powers so much before having to wait for them to recharge, which can be done quicker by engaging in, again, lightsaber combat. So ideally you want to be using all of these together. But then lastly, we do have a sort of ultimate that recharges over time, which is a big mass enemy slow, which can be very helpful in combat. And while it's not exactly an I win button by any means, it does help provide you a good bit of breathing room if you either need to heal or just want to reposition yourself. Though all of that together is relatively straightforward, I would say. The challenge of it, if any, comes with dealing with large numbers of enemies. As any single enemy, once you kind of learn their attack pattern, is pretty straightforward. The game likes to throw large waves of enemies at you, because of the wide variety of powers available to you. So trying to deal with that and approach it while, again, just surrounded by enemies in some cases can actually be the real challenge of it. But nonetheless, altogether, that makes for a fun combat system. The actual combat itself feels pretty great. There's a lot of lightsaber-oriented dismemberments, reflecting blaster bolts back at the people shooting them, using force powers to push people off of ledges. All the usual stuff is there. It feels fun. The combat itself feels very very fluid, and my main complaint here is simply that once you kind of get the feel for the combat, that's pretty much it. The game's not really going to evolve that combat in any meaningful way, as there's not a huge variety in terms of what's available to you, even with the differences that are available here. So while the combat is fun and everything, I do think there comes a point relatively short ways into the game where it's like, all right, that's pretty much everything it's got to show you. And as a result of this, probably I would say 4 or 5 of the boss fights feel exactly the same. All of that does finally bring us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I really like the way that this game tried to expand and build upon in everything from the first game. To my mind, and admittedly my own preference, that's what makes a great sequel. Don't fundamentally alter it. Flesh out what was already there and working. The other side of this is that combat and movement feels great. It might look a little janky at times, but it feels very good. And because of this, while a lot of the gameplay mechanics at play here don't exactly reinvent the wheel, it is nonetheless a ton of fun and pretty enjoyable. On the negative side of things, there's the obvious bad performance, just kind of across the board really, that might eventually get fixed or mitigated to a point where it honestly doesn't matter so much. But right now it's a very big glaring issue, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. But besides just that, I do think the cosmetics are a bit overboard. It was already kind of overdone in the first game, and then here, I would say most of your rewards for exploration wind up being cosmetic stuff, and if you took those out, the game just wouldn't have a ton of content. And while I certainly don't hate the cosmetic stuff, and this is admittedly a very minor gripe, it just feels like there's way too much of it, especially seeing as it's being used as the primary reward for getting you out and exploring the world, which is like the key gameplay here. And then the other negative that I wanted to talk about is that there's probably a little too much, I would say, platforming in some parts of the game. And I didn't really talk about this elsewhere, but there was, for instance, one section of the story where it was just like a 3-hour stretch of me running around doing platforming puzzles, all while chasing a single objective, and it went on for way too long. And while that was the longest case, there were several cases where I was at it for like an hour or two, and in several cases, I think it went on way too long. Especially because the game at that point isn't really showing you anything new. Like I said, the combat variety just kind of isn't there. So I wind up jumping through very simple platforming puzzles, fighting enemies that are no threat for an egregiously long amount of time. And it definitely got to a point a couple of times where it was like, why are we doing this right now? Which is made a little bit worse by the fact that some of that platforming is a little unintuitive. Now, much of it is obvious. This is a relatively rare case, but sometimes the path forward will be like hidden in a corner and it's like a little crevice you have to sneak through, but the game doesn't give you any indication about this. And it happened probably 5 or 6 times throughout the game where I had to basically carefully study the holo map to understand where I was even supposed to be trying to go. And I really think that piece of it could have been cleaned up. Though I fully admit those are minor and somewhat niche complaints of mine outside of the PC performance. Which does finally bring us to our conclusion, which is a bit of a frustrating one. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a great game. I don't think it's going to reinvent the wheel for anyone or anything, but a lot of the mechanics at play here are fun, they're polished, they're fun to engage with. However, the same cannot be said for the performance of the game itself, which is why we're seeing these widespread reports of crashes, bugs, etc., many of which I experienced myself, and while I had a better experience than most people, it was still very noticeable and cost me several hours of game time staring at a loading screen because the game compiles shaders, it looks like, at the beginning, which means every time the game crashes, I have to sit through that again. And while that's fine a few times, the amount this game is crashing, it gets old real quick. And all of that leads to a very negative experience that has very little to do with the gameplay or gameplay elements. Which then gives us the bizarre situation where I have to tell you that this is a great game that I simply wouldn't buy right now until they get some of this cleared up. And I think in the case of a big AAA publisher where that was almost certainly known before the game was released presents a real problem where it looks very disingenuous and, quite frankly, to a lot of people, deliberately deceitful. And while I genuinely doubt we will ever actually know the full truth behind situations like this, It's the kind of thing that puts a bad taste in people's mouths, and sadly, it continues to be the case for PC in particular this year, which is only making the response to this one that much more pronounced than it might otherwise be. At the end of the day, for a game that is trying to push it up to the price point of $70 US for AAA price to be released in a relatively broken state, at least for a lot of people, makes it pretty much impossible to recommend right now, even though it's a great game. So in terms of purchasing it, the smart move is obviously to hold off until some of this stuff is fixed, after which you'll have a great experience. Because otherwise, you're just kind of rolling the dice on how well this is going to run on your PC or even console, which is very unfortunate. But that is pretty much all I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video, hope it was thorough enough for you. But by all means, let me know what you guys think about the game or your thoughts down below in the comments, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.